November 7, 1944, in the cold gray dawn of the European theater of World War II, the rain-soaked fields of eastern France were still covered in mist when senior American commanders gathered around field reports that predicted the outcome of a battle before it had even begun. And among those assessments was a grim remark attributed to General Omar Bradley, who, after reviewing the operational orders for a segregated African-American armored unit preparing to enter combat against dug-in German defenses, was reported to have said that they would not last an hour, a statement shaped by the prejudice, doubt, and institutional skepticism that surrounded black soldiers in the United States Army at that time, even though those same men were about to prove through grit, skill, and relentless determination that they were fully capable of fighting as effectively as any formation on the battlefield during World War II. That unit was the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black armored battalion placed under the operational command of General George S. Patton, a commander whose reputation for aggression, speed, and relentless offensive action meant that any formation assigned to his army would be pushed to its absolute limit in both endurance and combat pressure. And as the battalion prepared to roll forward toward the German lines, its soldiers understood that they were fighting not only against the enemy in front of them, but also against years of prejudice and institutional doubt inside their own military. The date marked a pivotal moment in the broader narrative of World War II because the Allied armies were pressing eastward following the breakout from Normandy, and the German forces, though weakened, were still formidable, entrenched, and capable of lethal counterattacks, especially in terrain that favored defense and armored ambushes. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion had trained for years before being allowed into combat, having lived through the paradox of being asked to serve their country while facing segregation, restricted opportunities, and constant questioning of their competence. And yet, when the battalion finally received orders to move into action, they did so with discipline, professionalism, and a determination to prove that their service was not defined by the assumptions others had placed upon them. Many of them carried personal motivations rooted in inequality back home, and stepping into their tanks on that November morning, they understood that every mile they advanced, every position they seized, and every village they helped to liberate would speak louder than the dismissive judgments that had cast doubt upon them before the battle began. As engines started and treads began to grind through mud and frozen soil, the battalion advanced in support of infantry formations engaged in combat across sectors held by German defensive units determined to halt the American offensive. Combat reports from the period describe the fighting as intense, confused, and unforgiving, with enemy anti-tank guns, concealed machine gun nests, and artillery fire targeting advancing American armor as it attempted to maneuver through narrow roadways and open fields. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion faced the same danger every armored crew confronted in World War II, the knowledge that a single armor-piercing round could tear through steel plating and ignite fuel or ammunition within seconds. Yet they pressed forward, coordinating with infantry, returning fire, and adjusting their movements while under constant threat. Their actions during those first hours of combat refuted the expectations placed upon them, because instead of collapsing under pressure, the battalion demonstrated resilience, tactical coordination, and determination, continuing to push ahead even as casualties mounted and terrain conditions complicated every maneuver.
In the educational context of World War II history, the experience of the 761st Tank Battalion reveals the intersection between military policy, racial segregation, and battlefield performance, showing how systemic barriers shaped both perception and opportunity for African American soldiers in the Army. The battalion had been formed during a time when segregated units were often limited to support roles, and many officers doubted whether they should be placed in front-line combat positions. Yet when operational needs increased during the European campaign, the Army began deploying more segregated combat units into action. Patton himself, though reflecting the prejudices of his era, recognized that the battalion was highly trained and capable, and he insisted that they be given the opportunity to fight, warning them sternly that the world was watching and that their performance would influence how black soldiers were judged across the military during World War II. As the fighting intensified throughout the day, the battalion encountered repeated German counterattacks, with enemy forces attempting to exploit terrain advantages and disrupt the American advance. Tank crews communicated urgently over radios, coordinating fire, shifting positions, and engaging targets that appeared suddenly from tree lines and fortified village streets. In many engagements, the 761st had to operate alongside infantry caught in exposed positions, and its tanks provided crucial suppressing fire that allowed those infantry units to maneuver, withdraw, or advance. Each action built upon the last, demonstrating both tactical proficiency and reliability under fire, contradicting every assumption embedded in the earlier dismissive prediction that they would not withstand sustained combat. Reports and first-hand accounts from the period describe moments when tanks of the 761st pushed forward through heavy fire to destroy entrenched German positions, sometimes holding ground longer than expected and refusing to pull back even when resistance stiffened. These actions revealed not only courage, but also an evolving degree of trust from nearby American formations, who began to view the battalion not as an experiment or an uncertain asset, but as a dependable combat partner in the harsh realities of mechanized warfare. Through these engagements, the battalion contributed materially to the broader Allied push through France and into territories where German defenses attempted to stabilize their weakening lines, reinforcing the strategic momentum of the Western Front during World War II. At the same time, the battalion's progress challenged existing prejudices within segments of the Army leadership structure, where doubts about the effectiveness of black combat units had persisted for years. The performance of the 761st forced commanders to reevaluate long-held assumptions and to recognize that the limitations placed upon African American soldiers were rooted not in capability but in discriminatory policy. Educational analysis of this period reveals how combat realities often reshaped institutional perceptions and how the bravery and effectiveness of segregated units paved the way for broader discussions about integration, recognition, and equal military opportunity in the years following World War II. As the days following November 7th unfolded, the battalion continued operating across multiple sectors, participating in extended combat operations that required endurance, logistical resilience, and sustained discipline under rotating leadership and shifting orders. Their continued presence at the front demonstrated that they were not a symbolic or temporary force, but a fully integrated component of the operational structure of the U.S. Army in that theater. Every engagement added to a growing record of documented performance, reinforcing the evidence that the earlier statement predicting their failure was rooted not in tactical assessment, but in prejudice, and history would show that the battalion did far more than simply last an hour. They endured through some of the most demanding battles of the European campaign in World War II.
Their experience offers a powerful educational lens for understanding the social and structural dimensions of wartime service, demonstrating how marginalized soldiers were compelled to prove their worth in conditions where success was measured not only in strategic terms, but also in symbolic weight. The 761st Tank Battalion's actions illustrated how courage and professionalism developed within adversity, and how battlefield experience challenged and reshaped perceptions within an institution shaped by segregation. Through their resolve, they contributed both to the immediate tactical objectives of the Allied advance and to the longer historical trajectory that would influence debates about military equality long after World War II had ended. And as the battalion continued forward, village by village and ridge by ridge, their legacy grew through the stories preserved in after-action reports, personal accounts, and historical records that documented how a unit once doubted at the threshold of battle went on to play a critical role in the fighting, establishing a lasting place in the complex and evolving history of World War II. As operations expanded across the region in the weeks that followed, the 761st Tank Battalion found itself engaged in a series of sustained armored movements that demanded persistence as much as courage, because the fighting on the European front during this phase of World War II was no longer defined by short, isolated clashes, but by continuous advances, counterattacks, and grinding positional struggles that tested the physical and psychological endurance of every soldier involved. The the battalion moved through cold weather, muddy terrain, and shattered towns where the remnants of earlier battles could still be seen scattered along the roadsides. And each new assignment reinforced the reality that their contribution was now integral to the broader operational framework of the advancing American forces. During these extended operations, tank crews faced conditions that went beyond direct combat threats, as mechanical fatigue, limited visibility, harsh winter weather, and supply difficulties added layers of complexity to every mission they undertook. Inside their tanks, crews operated for hours at a time in cramped, noisy, and dangerously vulnerable spaces, where constant alertness was essential because enemy fire could strike without warning from hidden anti-tank positions or from German units lying in wait among damaged buildings and wooded areas. Despite these conditions, the battalion continued to perform with consistency, demonstrating the discipline and technical proficiency that came from years of rigorous training long before they had ever been given the chance to fight in World War II. Historical records from the period note numerous instances in which the battalion was assigned to reinforce exposed sectors or to assist infantry formations that were struggling to hold their positions against German resistance. In these situations, the presence of the 761st Tank Battalion often changed the momentum of the engagement, as their tanks provided both firepower and psychological support to units under pressure. Infantry soldiers who initially carried the same doubts that surrounded the battalion's deployment began to recognize their reliability through shared combat experience, and this gradual shift in perception played a significant role in reshaping attitudes towards segregated units in the field. Within headquarters discussions, after-action reports increasingly reflected acknowledgement of the battalion's capabilities, noting their resilience, coordination, and ability to adapt to complex battlefield situations. Officers who had once expressed skepticism were now recording evidence of tactical effectiveness that could not be dismissed or minimized. This development held deep educational importance in the broader study of World War II military history because it illustrates how performance in combat often became the most powerful argument against institutional prejudice, forcing leaders to confront the difference between long-standing assumptions and demonstrated results.
At the same time, the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion carried a heavy awareness of the symbolic weight of their service, knowing that every mission they completed and every position they helped secure would influence how future African-American soldiers would be judged in the United States Army. Many of them wrote letters home describing both the dangers they faced and the determination they felt to prove that their unit belonged on the front lines of World War II, not as an exception, but as a fully capable combat formation. Their experience became a lived testimony to the reality that opportunity, rather than inherent limitation, was the deciding factor in military performance. As winter deepened and the strategic situation in Europe grew increasingly volatile, the battalion's operational responsibilities expanded further, placing them in engagements that demanded rapid maneuvering, defensive holding actions, and coordinated offensives alongside multiple American divisions. These operations required precise communication, disciplined command structures, and an ability to respond under immense battlefield pressure, all qualities that the battalion displayed repeatedly as they remained engaged throughout demanding phases of the campaign. Through these actions, they continued to dismantle the narrative that had once predicted their failure before they had even entered combat. Their ongoing presence on the front reinforced a critical lesson in the historical study of World War II, that capability in warfare is shaped by training, leadership, and opportunity, rather than by race or preconceived bias. The 761st Tank Battalion's performance challenged the Army's segregated policies at a moment when the nation was fighting for democratic principles abroad while still struggling with inequality at home. Their actions on the battlefield added momentum to a longer historical movement toward change, not through speeches or political declarations, but through the undeniable reality of their contribution to Allied victory operations. And as the battalion continued to advance through the harsh landscapes of the European front, moving from one contested sector to another, their story remained in motion, unfolding through the missions they accepted,
the ground they covered, and the resilience they demonstrated alongside the soldiers who fought beside them during the long and demanding campaigns of World War II. The next morning of November 9, 1944, the fields of northeastern France were still slick with rain and churned mud as the troops of the 761st Tank Battalion prepared to move again, their engines rattling in the cold air, while the sound of artillery echoed across the Lorraine countryside during World War II. The men had slept inside their tanks or beneath canvas sheets stretched over turret barrels, and they moved carefully through the darkened landscape, aware that every hedgerow and every cluster of trees could hide a German anti-tank gun, a dug-in infantry team, or a machine gun nest waiting for them to advance just a little too far. The landscape around them was scarred by weeks of battle, with farmhouses shattered into skeletal walls and roads cratered and broken by shells. But the mission remained the same: keep pushing, keep advancing, keep supporting the infantry who walked alongside their tanks in the freezing mud. As the battalion rolled forward, officers briefed their crews once more on the importance of coordination between armor and infantry, reminding them that success in modern mechanized warfare relied on timing, discipline, and an understanding of how each branch of the army supported the other in World War II. The battalion's junior officers, many of them young and carrying the weight of responsibility far beyond their years, studied their maps, while sergeants checked radios, ammunition racks, and the condition of the Sherman's engines. Some of the men, hardened by earlier engagements, spoke in low voices about lessons learned from the previous days, how German ambush tactics worked, how quickly a tank could be lost to a hidden gun, and how vital it was to avoid overextending ahead of friendly lines. By late morning, the battalion approached another French village that had been fortified by German defenders determined to delay every Allied step forward. The lead tanks slowed as scouts reported narrow streets, stone walls, and fields lined with drainage ditches that could easily trap the heavy machines. The men inside the tanks could hear the distant thump of mortars and the sharp crack of rifles as American infantry made contact at the outskirts. Communications flowed steadily across radios as platoon leaders coordinated movements, and the tanks advanced in pairs, using smoke and cover to minimize their exposure. In the confined streets, every turn created tension, and every corner felt like a threshold into uncertainty during World War II. When the first German anti-tank round slammed into a nearby building and showered debris across the road, the battalion's gunners responded with rapid, disciplined fire, not in panic, but with the precision drilled into them through months of intense training. Tank commanders called out target positions, while loaders worked relentlessly, shoving shell after shell into the breach as the gun barrels recoiled and roared again. The sound reverberated between stone walls, and the village filled with dust, smoke, and the echoing clash of urban combat. Infantrymen took cover behind tanks, advancing step by step as the armor suppressed enemy positions that had been dug into cellars, barns, and defensive barricades. Throughout the day, the battalion's crews encountered obstacles that demonstrated the complexity of armored warfare in World War II, from mines buried beneath the muddy roads to concealed German positions that waited for tanks to expose their sides. Engineers moved alongside the battalion, probing for traps and clearing debris, while medical teams evacuated the wounded under fire. The reality of combat weighed heavily on every man involved. Victories were measured not only in miles gained, but in the survival of comrades who had fought side by side through relentless conditions. And yet, the battalion continued to push forward, proving their resilience, professionalism, and capacity to endure under pressure. By the afternoon, rain began to fall again across the region, soaking uniforms and transforming the battlefield into a slick, treacherous expanse of mud and standing water. The tanks struggled for traction as treads churned through the soft ground, and drivers fought to maintain control on narrow farm roads that seemed to dissolve beneath them.
Despite these challenges, the battalion maintained formation, understanding that separation between tank elements could leave them vulnerable to flanking attacks in World War II. Radio operators worked constantly to keep units aligned, relaying changes in route, terrain conditions, and enemy sightings as the front shifted hour by hour. Inside the tanks, the atmosphere was tense and claustrophobic, filled with the smell of fuel, hot metal, and cordite from spent shells. The men could feel every jolt of the vehicle as it lurched over craters and tree roots, and every impact against the armor sent vibrations through the steel hull. The emotional burden of combat blended with the technical demands of operating complex machinery under fire, and yet the crews remained disciplined, communicating in short, focused commands that reflected their training and shared experience. Their performance exemplified how combined arms operations evolved throughout World War II, where success depended not only on bravery, but on the integration of skill, coordination, and tactical understanding. As evening approached, the battalion received new orders to reposition toward another sector where German counterattacks had threatened to break through weakened Allied lines. The rapid redeployment underscored the fluid nature of the battlefield, where gains made earlier in the day could be challenged by enemy movements at night. The tanks rumbled back onto the road network, headlights blacked out for security, guided only by dim markers and the faint silhouettes of vehicles ahead of them. The men understood that night operations posed additional risks, limited visibility, increased likelihood of miscommunication, and the constant danger of friendly fire incidents. Yet they proceeded with the same determination that had characterized every phase of their deployment in World War II. The cold night air settled over the countryside as the battalion halted in a wooded area just short of the forward line, engines idling, while commanders gathered around maps illuminated by small, shielded lamps. Reports from reconnaissance units indicated that German forces had established defensive positions along a ridge that overlooked a key road junction, a position that allowed them to direct fire onto advancing Allied units and disrupt supply movements. The task assigned to the battalion was clear: support the infantry in seizing the ridge and securing the junction, preventing further enemy interference with the broader operational advance. Before dawn, the crews prepared once more, checking their equipment in silence while mist drifted across the fields. In those early hours, the weight of responsibility felt especially heavy, the knowledge that their actions would shape not only the outcome of a single engagement, but also the safety of thousands of soldiers who depended on their ability to break through enemy resistance in World War II. The battalion's leaders emphasized caution, discipline, and coordination, ensuring that every man understood his role as the operation prepared to unfold in darkness and uncertainty, with the first light of morning still hidden beyond the horizon.
The first faint glow of November dawn crept over the horizon. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion tightened the straps on their helmets, adjusted their gloves, and climbed back into the steel interiors of their Shermans, aware that the next few hours could determine whether the Allied line held firm or fractured under German pressure during World War II. The ridge ahead of them was still cloaked in mist, its contours barely visible through the shifting gray haze, and the silence that lingered in those moments before the attack felt heavier than the roar of battle itself. Inside the tanks, engines rumbled quietly at idle, while commanders listened for final radio instructions, their thoughts fixed on the terrain, the enemy positions, and the men who trusted them to make the right decisions when the shooting started. When the order finally came to move, the tanks rolled forward in staggered formation, their treads crushing frozen grass and breaking through patches of shallow frost that covered the fields. Infantry advanced alongside them, silhouettes fading and reappearing through the rising fog, each step accompanied by the metallic clatter of gear and the soft thud of boots in wet soil.
The coordination between armor and infantry reflected months of training and adaptation throughout World War II, a constant process of learning how to fight together in environments where every mistake could cost lives. The ridge loomed closer, its slopes revealing signs of German entrenchments, shallow foxholes, camouflaged gun pits, and communication trenches that wound across the hillside like scars left by earlier engagements. The first bursts of German machine gun fire broke the stillness, cutting through the air from concealed positions near the crest of the ridge. Tracers stitched across the open ground as infantry dropped to cover and the tanks elevated their guns to return fire. Commanders called out corrections, while gunners scanned for muzzle flashes, and loaders worked with relentless urgency, sliding shells into the breach as the main guns thundered and recoiled. The fog thickened the smoke of battle, obscuring shapes and blurring the edges of the landscape. Yet the battalion advanced steadily, using terrain features for cover and refusing to be driven back by the intensity of resistance in World War II. As the Shermans pushed farther up the slope, the battalion encountered the full complexity of the German defensive system. Anti-tank guns, carefully positioned to fire across likely approach routes, waited for moments when a tank exposed its flank or paused for even a second too long. A sudden blast shook the ground as one of these guns opened fire, its shell slamming into the earth beside a leading tank and showering it with dirt and fragments. The crews reacted instantly, maneuvering to reduce their silhouettes, while gunners scanned for muzzle flashes, and loaders worked with relentless urgency, sliding shells into the breach as the main guns thundered and recoiled. The fog thickened the smoke of battle, obscuring shapes and blurring the edges of the landscape. Yet the battalion advanced steadily, using terrain features for cover and refusing to be driven back by the intensity of resistance in World War II.
By mid-morning, parts of the ridge began to fall under Allied control, though German resistance remained fierce in clusters of fortified positions that refused to yield. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion maneuvered carefully among shell holes and shattered trees, aware that every advance brought them closer to the point where the enemy might launch a counterattack. The battalion's discipline and resilience under fire reflected both their training and the hard lessons of earlier battles, where success was earned through endurance, tactical patience, and an unwavering commitment to their mission despite the dangers that surrounded them on every side in World War II. As the fighting continued, the weather shifted once more, and clouds rolled across the sky, dimming the light and casting the battlefield into a muted gray. The damp air seeped through uniforms and gloves, numbing fingers and stiffening muscles, yet the crews remained focused, their actions guided by repetition and instinct formed through countless hours inside their tanks. Every movement, adjusting a periscope, rotating a turret, aligning a shot, carried significance because precision meant survival, and survival meant the ability to continue supporting the broader Allied advance across Europe during World War II. The ridge, though gradually being secured, still presented ongoing threats from isolated German pockets that used the terrain to their advantage. Some defenders withdrew into wooded areas and ravines, regrouping for localized counterattacks meant to disrupt the Allied foothold. The battalion prepared for these possibilities, repositioning tanks to cover likely approach routes while coordinating with infantry units establishing defensive lines along the newly captured high ground. From their elevated vantage point, the crews could now see the surrounding countryside, fields, roads, and valleys that had been contested for weeks, each stretch of land bearing the marks of sustained conflict. In the hours that followed, the battalion's presence on the ridge became a stabilizing force for neighboring units, providing fire support wherever German movements were detected and reinforcing sectors that risked being overrun. Their role extended beyond direct combat. They formed a shield that allowed supply convoys, medical teams, and additional infantry to move forward with greater security.
This demonstrated how armored units served not only as offensive spearheads, but also as critical anchors within larger operational frameworks shaped by World War II strategy and logistics. Yet even as control of the ridge strengthened, the men of the battalion understood that their work was far from over. The front lines in this region shifted constantly, and every gain came with the expectation that fresh orders could send them into another engagement before they had time to rest. Inside the tanks, the crews spoke quietly about fuel levels, mechanical strain, and the condition of their equipment, aware that breakdowns or shortages during a renewed attack could prove as dangerous as enemy fire. Maintenance and readiness were as vital as courage, forming the unseen backbone of sustained armored operations in World War II. As the afternoon wore on, the battalion remained alert, scanning the valley below for signs of movement, while infantry consolidated their positions and engineers strengthened the newly won defenses. The tension of anticipation hung in the air, a reminder that in this phase of the campaign, no victory felt final, and no position could be assumed safe for long. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion stayed prepared to respond at a moment's notice, their engines cooled but ready, their radios monitored, and their eyes fixed on a battlefield that continued to evolve with every passing hour during World War II.